on YouTube as well. The YouTube channel, I'll be sending that out again to everyone. But once again, thank you everyone for coming. We're very excited to have Wendy Adair, one of our partners at Icy Edge and Trivity, with us to present this session. You are all familiar with her and her work, so I don't think we need a lot of introduction, but I think I'll turn it over to you, Wendy.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks everyone for joining. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and names and some new ones as well. I heard some people say this is the first one of these book talks you've been to, so I just want to open up with, I guess I should introduce myself first. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and I'm in the Industrial Organizational Psychology department there. And my research and my teaching focuses on cross-cultural negotiation and conflict management and multicultural teams. And the book that we have been featuring in these talks, What Isn't Being Said, Culture and Communication at Work, is something that my colleagues and I wrote over the past couple years. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's really an academic book. So it's great for a review of the existing literature on cross-cultural communication in all the different domains of work. So there's a chapter on leadership and a chapter on conflict management. And then, so we review the existing literature in the context of what we teach with Intrivity and Icy Edge, which is understanding the message, relationship, time, and space domains of nonverbal communication. So we use those four domains as an organizing framework to think about research that has already been done and then to propose new research directions. So it's great if you are a researcher. It's great if you are supervising students or grad students, if you are someone who is in practice, working in industry, it's still a great review of what we know. And I've put today's talk together in that sort of what we know, what we don't know. So I think it's really good for really anybody. But I guess I wanted to sort of point out that it was written in a very academic style. So if some of you who are practitioners pick it up and find it's quite dry, that's why. But these talks translated into a more accessible format, perhaps. So feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions. The chapter I'm going to go over today is one of the leanest chapters because there just hasn't been a whole lot of research on nonverbal communication in these areas, voice, gossip, and feedback, as some other areas in the workplace. So I'll definitely be stopping at the end of each section and seeing if you have examples you'd like to share or questions you'd like to raise, and we can have a bit of a discussion along the way, but you can also stop me at any time if you have questions. Okay, so the chapter is organized into three sections, one on voice, one on gossip, and one on feedback. I have a few quotes also sprinkled throughout just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. Sorry, I have to move you, friends, so I can see my slide. Okay. So we wrote, as university faculty, we have noticed that among our diverse groups of graduate students, North American students tend to gossip in larger groups and in the presence of faculty. In contrast, students from East and South Asia tend to approach faculty privately to convey overheard student gossip. And I had to use that quote because this just happened to me literally a week ago, where we had a new class being taught by a new faculty member, and during the break, a bunch of students from one of the areas in our department were sort of, I wasn't there, I heard this from other people, but they were gathered in the hallway talking about sort of what they liked and what they didn't like about this class. It's a brand new class. Some of the things, weren't what they expected. And they were just in the hallway, just practically right in front of the professor talking about it. And then one of my students, though, who is South Asian, she was not in that group of people. She said that she felt very uncomfortable, but she later came to me in our weekly one-on-one research meeting and told me sort of her perspective on this new course and what she thought was good or not so good about it, and whether she was going to keep it or drop it. But it was exactly this. The North American Canadian students were just right out in the open in public doing their gossip. And then this other student of mine was not comfortable with that. So that's one example. It's from gossip, but I'm actually going to talk about voice and silence first. And I'll start out just by defining them so we're all on the same page. So voice is an informal, extra role communication behavior with the intention of helping to achieve a work goal. Okay. So you may have heard this referred to as speaking up, right? So it's when someone raises their hand and says, actually, I think we should be looking at this other thing, or there may be a problem with the approach we're taking. So the important facets of this definition are that it's not a behavior that's required by your role and responsibilities, that the intention is helping, right? So when someone engages in voice, they are trying to improve processes or outcomes in the workplace. And it is goal oriented, right? So those are sort of the key parts of that definition that distinguish it from some of the other informal communication behaviors I'll talk about today. So their voice can be both supportive or critical. Again, the intention is always to help improve things, but in doing that, someone could speak up and say, oh, I think this is really good, we should do more of X, or that would be promotive. Or someone could speak up and say, I don't think we should do Y because that's not going to look good to whoever. Right. So they're saying let's stop doing something in order to achieve our goals. And importantly, engaging in voice involves risk, right? Because particularly with prohibitive voice, speaking up and pointing out something that maybe a barrier or something that's not helpful in the workplace could make one vulnerable to criticism or some other sort of punishment kind of responses. Silence is in some ways the opposite of voice. It is a conscious decision not to speak up. So there's a situation where you could speak up and you make a choice to stay silent. So silence often, it would be more akin to sort of the prohibitive side of voice, right? So it would be pointing out something that a manager did incorrectly, or some sort of unfair treatment or moral violations. That's typically what the literature has touched on when they look at silence. There's three reasons for people engaging in silence. So acquiescent is when people don't speak up because they think it won't change anything. It's not going to make a difference. Quiescent is when people don't speak up because they're afraid of being punished for speaking up. And pro-social is when people don't speak up because they don't want to embarrass others, or they don't want their manager to lose face. Okay, so those are the constructs, voice and silence. And of the three topics today, this is the one that we have the most literature on already with respect to low and high context communication styles, as well as nonverbal communication. So there is some literature that looks at direct voice and indirect voice, right? So you can imagine direct voice is going to be more common in low context cultures, and indirect voice will be more common in high context cultures. So an example of direct voice would be, speaking up directly to the person that is a decision maker or is involved, and using explicit language to state what your concern is. Okay. And so one study shows that this is more common in the US, and that it's preferred in the US and China, so it's common in both, but the reason behind it is different. So in the US, these researchers found that people who say that they speak up, engage in voice in a direct manner, they do that because it's the credible way, the responsible, credible way to do things. And in China, people gave reasons for why they might speak up in a direct fashion, and they attributed it to politeness. And then some other research on direct voice has found that it's more effective if it's just one-on-one, so a subordinate directly to their supervisor versus in some sort of a public setting. The literature on indirect or implicit voice, we don't have any research showing sort of where it's more or less common. Rather, the research is just defining what it would look like. So an example of indirect voice might be asking a question. So you don't directly say, I think we should do something differently, or I think we should do more of this thing, but you would frame it in terms of a question. Do you think other people would think this is a good idea? Or making hints at what it is you want to say. And then also engaging in political correct speech. The research has said can be an example of indirect voice. Okay, so silence. The literature on that has done some cross-cultural comparisons and found that silence is more common in cultures that have values for high power distance, high collectivism, and high face concern, versus cultures that do not endorse those values to the same degree. And then the last two findings I want to talk about are actually from a paper that was done by Ward et al. And that is a student of Nancy Buchan, who is also a co-founder of Intrivity Icy Edge. And so in their study, they looked at prohibitive and promotive voice. And they did find differences based on communication style. So high context employees were less likely than low context employees to engage in prohibitive voice, right? So that's sort of the critical speaking up. And this was especially the case when a subordinate and a superior had a poor relationship. LMX's leader manager, that's not right. It can't be leader manager. LMX, leader manager exchange. I think that is what it stands for. So it's the relationship between two employees. And when it's low, it means they don't have a strong trusting relationship. And when it's high, they do have a strong trusting relationship. And then promotive voice. So people speaking up, saying what you can do good, what you're doing well and should do more of. They found not that it was used more often for low context employees, but that it was heard more often. So they listened to and responded to voice when it was promotive, more so in low context cultures than high context cultures. And this effect was prevalent when LMX was high, when there was already a strong trusting relationship. So those findings are a little complicated to understand, but it does. I wanted to mention them because it highlights sort of that there's lots of different variables beyond just communication style that you need to look at when you're looking at these kinds of behaviors. What's appropriate? What are behaviors are people most likely to engage in? And then how are people receiving or responding to those communication behaviors? It's not just lower high context, but it's the type of voice, it's the relationship between the parties involved, and all of those things play a role. Okay. So for what we don't know here, I wanted to highlight miscommunication as some areas that I think are really promising for future research. So oftentimes you can imagine an employee speaks up, particularly if they're speaking up using prohibitive voice, so they're sort of criticizing the way things are being done. That can be interpreted as a helping behavior, or it could be interpreted as a critical, non-helping behavior, right? So there's sort of that risk of misalignment between the intention behind the voice or silence behavior and then how it is interpreted. And that's what I'm calling miscommunication. And so I think this is especially prevalent if you have, a high context communicator delivering message, so engaging in voice or using silence, refraining from speaking up to a low context manager, or vice versa, a low context employee engaging in voice or silence, and the manager is high context. So when the communicators have different styles, that's when you're likely to have the message not being interpreted as intended. So Jean Brett is a researcher, cross-cultural negotiation researcher who has a great example of indirect voice and conflict management in a company that was importing bicycles. And so it was, I think, yeah, the bicycles were made in China and they were being imported to the US. And when the bicycles arrived, the US seller, they weren't up to quality because there was a rattle in the chain on the bike. And so Jean Brett gives these examples of how the US partner brought up this concern with the Chinese supplier, right? And so they didn't say something like, the chain quality is inadequate, I'm sending them back, right? Because that would be insulting, inappropriate, loss of face. What they did end up doing was, do you hear that chain rattle? That sounds different, doesn't it? So it's a sort of really indirect, implicit observation that the supplier immediately understood was a problem with the chains, and they spoke up and said, okay, send everything back, we're going to send you a new batch. So that worked out well in that particular situation. However, some people might hear, do you hear that chain rattle, and think that someone's being passive aggressive, right? So how exactly is it being interpreted? And then another example would be with patterns of silence. So you can imagine if an employee is engaging in silence, so they're not speaking up. Since they're not saying anything, if you realize they're not speaking up about something, there's just a plethora of attributions you could make for the reason that this person is not speaking up. So how do we interpret their silence? Do we interpret it as because the person's disinterested and doesn't care, or they're afraid of repercussions, so they're protecting the self? But right, understanding the intention when we're receiving and interpreting a message is going to be the really hard part with these behaviors. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about voice and silence, but I would like to pause here before I go on to the next topic to see if anyone has any experience with this or examples they'd want to share with the group. And you're also welcome to ask questions. Try to make this bigger so I can see everyone. Oh, we have some new people, I think.
Can you also see comments Wendy?
Let me see. Hold on one sec. Oh, now I can. Okay, that's from Elsa. It is leader. Leader member. Thank you, Christos. I was like, it can't be leader manager. It's leader member exchange. So it's supposed to be superior subordinate. Thank you very much. Okay, Kavita noted that they're reminded of communication happens on the terms or style of the listener from Thomas Erickson in Surrounded by Idiots. I don't know that book, but that sounds great. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we, are emphasizing in our book. And when we teach Intrivity Icy Edge is the fact that, you can be completely aware of your own communication style and you can painstakingly craft a message so that the person you're speaking to is going to understand, you think, exactly what you intend. But you never really know, right? Because there's so much going on with that other person, as well as the norms for the environment you're in. And so it's challenging. The miscommunication happens.
I have an
Uh,
example.
oh,
I was
lovely.
I was working with a Dutch furniture maker, and they were trying to do an organizational change, and there was to be a generational change founded by the grandfather, and it was now time for the grandson to take over and lead the company. And it was very interesting to watch them um, decide when to offer open criticism of what they thought should or should not happen. And
Mhm.
there's kind of an egalitarian thing going on. It's a very flat organization and everyone's equal, but there was also kind of a respect for the grandfather and the father. And what do I say when they're in the room or about their leadership and how they were doing it or what the new one is thinking could be the future. And it was really fascinating to see because the Dutch are usually relatively blunt about criticism.
Straightforward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when I do coaching with a different Dutch client, I'm often told from the Pacific Northwest of Oregon, where I like to joke we make Minnesotans look aggressive. Uh, we just did very, very conflict averse. I was told I was too soft, and I had to get much tougher in giving my
Uh-huh.
feedback. Okay, and but it was very interesting when the hierarchy and the actual elders were present, and
Oh, I
what would
love
be
that.
said and when. It was like, okay, different nuance, got to read it
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great example. Um, on a related note, I'm a late adopter for pretty much everything in life, and so I just started watching Ted Lasso, and I totally love it. But there is a really great communication style joke in there. One of the team players is from the Netherlands, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but he's being very blunt about something. And one of the other players is like, man, you're so mean. And then another player was like, no, he's not. He's Dutch. So good example. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. We'll pause again after the next section on gossip. Let me just see to make this smaller again. Okay. Okay, so a quote, another gossip quote from Baumeister. In our view, gossip, sorry, I still have to move this. In our view, gossip is a potentially powerful and efficient means of transmitting information about the rules, norms, and other guidelines for living in a culture. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this perspective on gossip because it's a really important one that people often don't think about when they're talking about gossip in the workplace. Okay, so what is gossip? It is defined as a social communication. So it's not about a task you're doing at work. It's about something in the social environment. And it's about a non-present other. So the person being talked about is not there when this conversation is happening. It's also been defined to try to for when people are studying gossip, they need to have a clear definition of what it is and what it isn't. So researchers have used this definition that it is something that refers to a non-normative behavior. So something that is unusual, surprising. It could be negative or it could be positive. And it could be something about work, not the tasks you're doing, right? But about that person at work or that person outside of work. So importantly, researchers have found that gossip has not only negative consequences, which a lot of people think when they hear about gossip, oh, it's bad, don't do that. But there are some positive functions of gossip in the workplace. So it has been found that it strengthens interpersonal bonds between employees. And then, as Baumeister noted, it communicates social norms within groups. So it's a way of groups in a really sort of informal way, reminding each other and reinforcing sort of what is and isn't normative behavior in that group. There's not a lot of research on this at all, on cross-cultural stuff. So I don't even have a what we know slide. I only have a what we don't know slide. After this, if anyone knows of literature that we missed, please let me know, because we weren't able to really find anything. So gossip is also, I should have mentioned, described in 3 different forms. So downward, top down, upward, employee to supervisor, or lateral. So employees at the same level in the organization. And what we don't know is sort of the different ways that gossip is encoded and expressed, particularly with respect to nonverbal behaviors, when it is these different kinds of gossip, downward, upward, and lateral. So that would be an interesting area to look for research. Another co-founder of Intrivity ICED, Xiao-Ping Chen, has done some research on something called inception, and it's the idea of, if you think of the movie Inception, it's the idea that you can plant an idea in someone's head without actually saying anything. And so she's very interested of the timing of gossip and its subsequent effectiveness as a tool for cultural learning, right? Is there certain times, imagine earlier versus later in someone's tenure in the organization, when gossip about something happens that would then impact the degree to which the cultural social understanding of the normative behavior happens faster or is more effective or stronger. And then the last one is the effects of more explicit versus implicit gossip in different cultural contexts. So, not only when is it more likely or less likely depending on cultural context, but what is the effect of it, again, on cultural learning or on people's understanding and awareness of the group norms. So let me pause again here and see if we have any questions or comments. Oh, Kavita, thank you. About the Ted Lasso. I love it when I find examples on TV. Any of your own experiences you'd like to share or questions you have about this idea of gossip?
This is Elsa. I
Elsa.
recently took a group of folks from various teams and various levels to our Tokyo office, and in these like group sort of there's lots of like social time after work, happy hours, dinners, whatnot, and that is in part one of the primary goals of this particular trip was relationship building and repair in some cases. And I found myself engaging in what felt to me like lateral gossip, but as I've reflected on this past trip, it actually was more downward. And I think I've actually been reflecting a lot in terms of just like my recently took on a new role. It's a little bit more of a leadership role and kind of being more realizing I need to be a little bit more thoughtful and delicate in terms of, I guess I didn't really up until this point, didn't really have vocabulary for it, but like it is downward gossip. And it's interesting to hear that there are some benefits, and I could see some benefits of like the gossip that I may have engaged in might be like to demonstrate like, hey, I'm with you. Like I feel, you know, this pain that you're describing, I feel it too. And I actually see a little bit more of it in X, Y, and Z ways, but I think it's a delicate balance. In terms, it's almost like I think about it in terms of oversharing.
Yes.
So it's something I've just kind of more been grappling from like a personal, like professional development perspective. So it's really helpful to have just like some, you know, nomenclature to put toward that as I think through this personally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And you reminded me that I should have said I made the assumption that everyone knows what sort of the negative effects of gossip can be, but I would like to just be a little bit more explicit about that. So the negative effects of gossip can be that you know, you're talking about someone when that person isn't there. So it could, if the person finds out about it, it could negatively affect your relationship. It could create, relationship conflict, tension. It could be seen as unprofessional. So there's sort of the idea that gossip is a bad thing has been around for a lot longer than these newer perspectives that, okay, well, it does have some potential downsides to it, but maybe it is also helpful in some ways in the workplace. So, okay, thanks for sharing that example. Okay, so the last one is feedback. There is surprisingly not a lot of cross-cultural research on feedback. So I'll go over what we do know, but it's really not a lot. This is a ripe area for research. So Ashford's quote here is, when a culturally diverse setting increases the instrumental need for feedback, the adjacent intercultural communication differences are likely to increase the effort costs of feedback seeking. There may also be differences between Western and non-Western cultures about whether feedback-seeking behavior is respectful or appropriate. Okay, so the second part of that quote is pretty easy to understand. The first part is a lot of academic speak, but basically they're saying that when you're in a cross-cultural workplace, you probably need feedback more than when you're in a unicultural or monocultural workplace, right? Because you're not sure if your work behaviors and approaches are normative for that setting, or what the other people from that culture think is appropriate and useful. So you really need, the instrumental need is greater for feedback in a cross-cultural setting. But because then we have intercultural communication challenges, that can make it even more difficult. Okay. So what is feedback? Feedback is the provision of information about an employee's work effectiveness to motivate and direct performance improvement. So it's specifically related to the employee's behaviors with respect to their roles and responsibilities. So what they're doing at work. And the point of feedback is it's constructive, right? So it's supposed to help the employee improve their job performance. The literature describes two things: feedback seeking and feedback delivery. So they really put the responsibility in both the employee to ask for feedback and the supervisor to deliver and provide feedback. And so for feedback seeking, there is some work showing that people are more likely to seek feedback from their supervisor than their peers when they're in a high power distance culture. So that makes sense, right? Because people are more aware of status and roles. So if they're asking, how can I do my job better? They're more likely to ask their boss that question than go laterally with it. And that feedback seeking is more indirect in high context cultures. So if you are approaching your boss or a peer in a high context culture and asking for feedback, you're unlikely to say it in a very direct, explicit way. Please tell me what I can do differently in order to perform my job better. And so here are some examples of what indirect feedback seeking might look like. Indirect discussions with the information source, the manager, manifested as hypothetical inquiries, like what would you think if I did this instead, or if this other employee took this other approach. Third-party inquiries, so instead of going to for feedback directly to your direct supervisor, you might go to a different supervisor. Inquiries about comparable peers, or disguised questions seeking information in the workplace. So there's sort of lots of indirect ways that people could go about getting some feedback on, how the boss thinks you're doing without explicitly asking that question. So for feedback delivery, the only study we found on this looked at, it was a cross-cultural study. They had multiple national cultures that they grouped into clusters of Anglo, Nordic, and Confucian clusters. And they found that feedback delivery was more frequent, so more common in Anglo cultures than Nordic or Confucian cultures, and that feedback delivery is more formal, top-down, and infrequent in Confucian clusters than the other two. So some good evidence there for cultural differences in the way people seek feedback, but also the way it's delivered. But we don't have a lot of details, so there's still a lot we don't know. One of the things I'm really interested in is, the sensory or the space domain of nonverbal communication. So how feedback is delivered or expressed and how it is interpreted based on the nonverbal cues when feedback is being delivered. So looking at things like tone of voice and eye contact for understanding, when feedback is sort of more critical versus maybe just a suggestion to try something differently, as opposed to, you're doing this wrong. You can be doing it in a different way. With the time domain, the frequency and the timing of feedback delivery, and in particular, we're interested in what that might look like in cultures that are very clock time oriented versus more event time oriented cultures. So you can imagine that in more event time oriented cultures where people move through the day reacting to sort of events as they arise and unfold, not necessarily paying strict attention to the clock at any given time. So you'd be less likely to have, a set meeting for your feedback, your performance review and your feedback in a culture like that. It might be more likely to be delivered sort of in an informal encounter in the hallway or something like that. And then lastly, what we don't know and would be interesting to know is the content of the feedback in low versus high context cultures. So Jeffrey Sanchez-Burks has some really good research showing how in North American cultures, what people talk about or pay attention to at work is very task focused. And in more Latin cultures and East Asian cultures, there's this whole other socio-emotional relational dimension to what people are aware of and talk about and pay attention to. And so that goes along with sort of different kinds of low versus high context communication styles and suggests that, what constitutes feedback might actually be different in different cultures as well. Okay, I'll pause there. Does anyone have any examples or questions on feedback or studies you'd want to do?
I have an example. Years ago, I was put on as a project manager for 360 assessment of international, trying to become global Japanese-based finance organization. And the consultant was Canadian, but with a long career in Switzerland. And so their way of setting it up was very linear and direct. You will answer these surveys on these days in this way. And, you know, being a 360, feedback was coming from peers and subordinates to the director of this particular finance organization. And what I've learned since is that common with these type of organizations, most of the people who were being asked were expatriated, but they identified as Japanese living around the world. And they all waited until literally the 48 hours before it was due. They weren't touching it. And then they all called my office and said, how do I answer this? I can't do this. You know, I can't put anything on a Likert scale that doesn't show that they're fabulous. And I can't possibly answer those questions. I'm going, no, it's anonymous. No one will ever know who typed in that answer. And they said, doesn't matter, can't do it, don't trust it. Nope, nope, nope. And it was just this
Yeah.
really interesting disconnect of, you know, we're going to give you direct feedback and won't that be a gift? And there was others like, oh, hell no.
I love that example. Thank you.
I just finished No Rules Rules, where with the Netflix CEO and Aaron Myers wrote that book together.
Oh.
And it's mostly about Netflix work culture, but the last chapter they look at the culture map and kind of evaluate the different Netflix global offices. And there's actually quite a bit of content about feedback delivery in that book, because Netflix is a very it's very much a tech company in that it's like very direct in terms of its feedback. And there's a specific section that talks about how they really struggled, but they faced challenges in terms of soliciting feedback from the Japanese team that they were building. And they share some examples on how they were able to get over that. But I think ultimately I came out of that book thinking like you really have to be like willing to work along Netflix culture to really thrive and survive there. Wendy, I'm recalling some. I quote this often during the ICEdge training last year. I was talking about how I work both in finance and tech, and you mentioned that both of those are very low context industries,
Yes.
and you put them together. And so I use that a lot in my workplace when I describe how we like need to be a little tailoring messages. Excuse me, there's a car. We need to be tailoring our messages and thinking a little bit more inclusively in how we communicate with folks who are not from very like hyper low context backgrounds. So that Netflix book could be interesting. It's I know, you know, Erin Myers has a very specific way of kind of approaching her work, but I came out with it with a lot of, I wouldn't say light bulb moments, but working in tech and working alongside a lot of the types of personalities they describe in that book, and a lot on feedback, I think could be interesting. It's not the research, I think, to the level that you're looking for, but it touches on it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm very familiar with her work in the culture map. So, and know sort of that writing style and stuff. So that sounds like a great resource for me to look at. Thank you. Oh, let me see. We got some chats here as well. No rules. Okay. Netflix and the culture of reinvention. Thank you very much. Okay, and then Mehdi has to leave. All right. Well, we're getting close to end here. So let me just see what else I wanted to cover. Okay, so again, if you're not familiar with the book, at the end of every chapter, we offer basically 4 propositions, and each proposition is about one domain of nonverbal communication, and where we think would be a good place for researchers to start looking to have a better understanding of how context dependence and communication style in fact impacts that workplace communication behavior. So we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm not going to read through these. They're also very academic speak, but that's what you'll find at the end of the chapter. And I'll come back here in a second. I just want to pop this up first. So this is the title of the 10 chapters in the book. And so you can see here, actually, chapters 1 and 2 and 10 are really unpacking sort of all of the theory behind the Intrivity Icy Edge model of teaching cross-cultural communication. So and then the other chapters, chapter 3 brings in theory from communication, cross-cultural communication. And then chapters 4 through 9 are each a different domain of workplace communication and how we can learn about and understand the role of nonverbal communication in that part of our work life. Okay, so that's that. And I think we have 4 minutes or so for further questions or discussion. Anyone else have anything they'd like to bring up or chat about?
If you don't mind, maybe you could elaborate on the research about Chinese prefer giving a direct communication, because that's very different from my personal experience, but I haven't read research on this part. I mean, Chinese are typically seen as high context cultures,
Yes.
and the direct communication is very much a no-no. So
Exactly.
so that part was yeah, a bit surprising to me.
It's surprising to me too. And so I remember the study because I didn't do it, I read it. And I remember I was very surprised by the findings. So they didn't measure what people actually do. They measured what people prefer. So they gave managers examples of feedback conveyed in a direct way and an indirect way. I believe it was the feedback that this one was. And then they asked people, like, of those 2, which would you prefer? And they found that everyone preferred the more direct way, but it doesn't mean that that's how they actually do it. So it was kind of an interest. It was sort of like this the way the authors wrote about it was that there's this, this bias towards directness in the workplace, even if it's not culturally normative for someone. If you give them the choice that way, they're going to say, oh yeah, direct is better.
Right, right. Well, but like in the actual Chinese work environment, if you're very direct and speak up, that yeah, that can be pretty risky.
Yes.
It risks your interpersonal relationship, and basically the advice that I get at my workplace is just don't speak up at meetings. And that's
Yeah, I
also
was
the behavioral
surprised.
norm. Yeah.
And I'm also, if I'm remembering correctly, the Chinese sample was Hong Kong Chinese. Would that make a difference?
That's exactly where I work.
Yeah.
I've been working in Hong Kong these last 24 years, and the first bit of advice that I get is to speak up in meetings. All decisions have already been made. So meetings are not there for discussion. It's basically a theater of power. It's just
Yes.
a procedure to formalize a decision already been made by the leaders.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your own experience with that and raising that question.
Well, thank you for making the book chapter more accessible.
Yeah, and you can buy it chapter by chapter, or you can buy the whole thing if you're interested. You can find it online. And we are hoping to make a research translation of the book. So a more sort of popular science version of the book that will have lots of colorful anecdotes and examples. We're just not exactly sure when that's going to happen. It was supposed to happen last year when I was on sabbatical, but it didn't. So now we're not sure when it will happen, but we will let you know when that version is out.
Well, it certainly take a long time to put
Yeah.
a book out. So congratulations for just, putting this one out is already something worth celebrating. So
Yeah, thank
and I
you.
can get the book from my library.
Oh, good, good.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. You did a great job, really translating that chapter for us.
My pleasure.
And always appreciated to have you. It's right at 1 o'clock. We really appreciate all of your participation. And like I said, I will make a recording of this and I will distribute it. And I will follow up with the programming that's to happen at the beginning. Most likely it will be the beginning of 2025 when we relaunch the new Lunch and Learn format. So if there's no other questions, I'll let everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Have a great weekend, folks.
Thanks,
Fabulous.
you too.
Chris.
Fabulous work as always.
Thank you.